Hi there folks, welcome to this guide showing the configuration and troubleshooting steps required to integrate BMC Enterprise Manager and System Center Orchestrator. First of all, we're going to take a quick look at the Orchestrator end of things. We're going to examine the Enterprise Event Manager objects and the configuration settings that are required. It's good to keep those in mind as we progress through the guide so you can see what information you're going to need to capture from your systems. So if we add a new configuration setting, I'm just going to give that a generic name, and let's have a look at the properties that are required. So you can see we need to specify the protocol, the cell name, the event manager host, and the port that we're listening on. That's the minimum configuration that we need. So moving on to our BEM system, we can see here we have a working BEM system. Let's just open that up so we can see there are some recent events within there. And let's have a look at the version. So you can see I'm using version 7.4 for this demonstration. The README guide does explain all of the versions that are supported with the integration pack. And let's take a quick look at the services that are running. So we can see we've got the necessary services running, and let's have a look for the Impact Integration Web Service, IIWS, and you can see that's not installed at the moment. So our first step is to install that web service. I've got the zip file straight from BMC. I'm going to extract that now. And once I've extracted that in the folder, we'll see there's a setup program. So we're going to execute that. You might have noticed I'm running this from terminal services. That means there's some extra setup required, but the installer guides you through those prerequisites quite straightforward. We're going to go through that anyway so you can see the detail. And it's just initializing. Here we go. So it's going through its prerequisite checks. And these are the prereqs that I'm talking about. Because we're running this over a remote desktop connection, if you logged into the console, you're not going to see that. If you're on an RDP connection like myself, you probably will. So the first thing we need to do is we need to check some of the policy settings with regard to temporary folders. So just following the instructions that it's provided on the screen, and I'm going into the terminal services settings. Let's just move them side by side so we can see exactly what it's telling us to do. So looking for remote desktop services. There we go. And remote desktop session host and expanding temporary folders. We can see there's two settings in there, and both of these settings need to be enabled. So do not delete temp folders on exit needs to be enabled. Let's just double check that, and that already is enabled. So moving on to the next one. And do not use temporary folders per session. This again is already enabled. As we move back to the requirements, you can see that if those are already enabled, then we also need to make a couple of quick registry changes. So I'm making those changes as well, starting at regedit. So it tells us we need HKey local machine, system, current control set, control, terminal server. Note it's terminal server and not remote desktop in this case, the internal. And there are two settings that we need in there. The first is delete temp DIRs on exit. Notice the change in the logic. The group policy setting was do not, and it needed to be enabled. In this case it is do this, and these need to be set to zeros. The installer does tell you exactly what you need to do to to set this up, and our next step is to reboot. So I'm going to exit out of the installer, close my windows, and quickly reboot the system. So restart. We'll skip some of the waiting, some magic of video. And as we fade back in, we're going to go straight into the installer and proceed with the installation. Okay, and we're getting into the detail. So it's the Impact Integration Web Service installation again. Notice it's version 7.4 matched to my BEM instance version. And again, going through those prerequisites, just making sure everything's in place so we have a successful install. Okay, so onto the next screen. User agreement, so yep, definitely agree to that. And the destination directory, I'm going to accept the default there, so just to next. So now this is an important point, we need to make a note of this. This is the ports that we're going to listen on for both HTTP and HTTPS, so I'm accepting the defaults of 9080 and 9443. And a confirmation there, and next. So let's on with the show. So it's doing its work. It'll be completed in a moment, and then we'll have an opportunity to browse the log file. There we go. So the files are installed. We're just doing the config now. You see there the installation is done. It's just starting the service. We'll verify that in a moment. Okay, so we'll just take a quick look in the log file. We're just checking for the final success confirmation at the end. So let's scroll down there. And there we go. That's what we're looking for. Happy with that, so we can move on to our troubleshooting. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is just confirm that the service is installed correctly and is running. So again, you can use PowerShell. You could use a services applet. I'm looking for IIWS. That's Impact Integration Web Service. There we go. So that's running. That's great. And let's have a look, see what's listening on port 9443 and on port 9080. So there we go, and we can see I've used the netstat options A, N, and O. O shows me the process ID that's listening at the end. So we can see process 2928 is using those ports. So let's have a quick look to see what that process is. I'm just correct my typo there. And there we go. We can see that it's Tomcat that's listening. So on my system at the moment, process ID 2928, process ID 2928 is the Tomcat process. So that's exactly what we wanted. So that's a good sign. So our first step, we're going to start up Internet Explorer and see if we can find, see a valid WSDL web service definition. So I wrote that out earlier. You can see using my IP address and port there, and I'm pasting that in. It's important to note you must match up the right protocol with the port number. So if you're checking on HTTPS, then make sure you're using the HTTPS port. If you put in the port for the HTTP connection, make sure that you use HTTP as the protocol at the start there. We can see we've got the WSDL back. Not too interested in the details at this stage. We have got a valid web service definition for the Impact Manager, so that's great. So to look in a little bit more detail and see what we've got configured, I'm using an open source tool called SOAP UI. It's very handy for checking out these SOAP, the web service integrations. So I'm entering the name for my project, and again the path to the WSDL in there, exactly the same as I pasted into the Internet Explorer window, and it's going off, pulling back the XML definition, and from that XML definition it's able to tell us what services are available, the functions that we can access, and we're particularly interested in the get cell info. This is a very simple request. We don't need to specify any information, but it verifies for us that the web service is running and it's returning valid information. So let's give that a try, and you'll see down at the bottom there that I've had the connection has been refused. This is just the SOAP UI configuration. The endpoint details by default are coming up with the wrong port. If we scroll up to the top there, we can see it's HTTP. It's got port 8080. So I'm going to edit that endpoint definition. And again, it's important to remember you must match the port and the protocol. So HTTPS, I need to specify 9443. Let's execute that again with the correct endpoint. And we can see we have a valid XML response there. It tells us some information about our BEM system. So that's a good sign. Now, what we must remember here is this local test. Although I've used the external IP address of the box, the system's going to loop back. So this is going to bypass the firewall rules. So let's just have a quick check of the firewall settings on this box. We could simply turn the firewall off. However, obviously that's not a desired setup for most people. So I'm first of all going to have a look using netsh at the current firewall settings. If you're not familiar with netsh, you can abbreviate the command. So the full command is netsh adv firewall show all profiles. I abbreviated that. We can see that the firewall is in fact enabled for all the profiles, and it's set to block the inbound connections. So I'm using another netsh command to add exceptions in for port 9080 and port 9443. So we've executed those now. So just to go back, I said that although we're testing using the external IP address, it is a local test. So using a network sniffer, I'm just going to show you that's the case. And we'll use a network sniffer as well to see those external requests that come in. It's a great confirmation that the request is getting to your web services box, and there aren't routing or name resolution or other connection problems. So I'm using Wireshark. I'm going to set a capture filter here. I'm only interested in traffic on those particular ports. Obviously there's an awful lot of other information that I want to filter out from that. And we're going to start the capture running. So the capture is running at the moment. Let's do a refresh in Internet Explorer. So we can see we've got our content back again. You can see no packets have been captured. Let's try the SOAP UI request again. So I'm just going to execute that get cell info function again. So that has been refreshed in 26 milliseconds, and again no data you can see. So what we need to do now is we need to move to our external box, and I'm again using SOAP UI first of all. I'm going to make a connection to that box. Just wait a moment while SOAP UI starts up. If you're not familiar with SOAP UI, it is a great tool for troubleshooting these connection problems. So I'm creating a new project. Okay, I'm going to test with HTTP this time. Obviously, the packet trace, I'd like to be able to see what's in there. If I use HTTPS, it's going to be encrypted. So we'll just use a plain HTTP request this time. So I've specified the protocol and the port there for HTTP. Again, we can see that all of the definitions have come back, and there's our get cell info. Let's make a new request. Before we send the request this time, we're going to update the endpoint. So again, you can see it's defaulted to port 8080. So we're just going to edit that to the correct port. There we go, and we're going to execute that. We can see the same cell info has been returned. Now if we go back to our packet trace, so you can see there have been a number of packets captured this time, and if we have a look at the conversation, if you like, the TCP stream, we can see the initial request and the response to that request, all of the detail that comes back when someone requests the web service definition and the raw HTTP requests. Okay, so that's looking good. We've obviously got a good connection between our BEM system and the external system. We've verified that now. So let's take a look within Orchestrator itself. We know the information that's required. So going into that connection settings dialog. So we need to enter the protocol. We're using the HTTP again, so the default is OK there. Let's enter the cell name within there. Let's enter the IP address of the Enterprise Manager host. And again, the port is fine, so we're using HTTP. Let's just double check that, and you can see, the cell name should be local rather than the host name of the box. So let's correct that. Let's hit OK on there, and let's try and configure our create event object. What you'll notice, the first time that you configure the object, there's a slight delay as Orchestrator goes over to the BEM system. It makes those requests to find out the information about the configuration, what events are available, and the required and optional parameters there. So I'm just entering a test message within there, and then let's take a quick look at the optional properties, what fields we could set, or the slots that we could set in that BEM event. You can see a complete list there. And let's execute this using the runbook tester. So we're going to run it first as the runbook tester. That means it's happening as the interactive user, the person that's logged onto the box, and we've already seen that SOAP UI is able to connect as this user. So we should be fairly confident that we can connect. And we can see there the event ID that comes back. This tells us that the event's been created and the web service has returned the ID of the event that was created on the system. So let's just turn the logging on, and we're now going to check in that runbook, and we're going to execute it through the runbook service. So now it's going to execute again, but with the permissions of the runbook server itself. And there we go, it's started. And what's actually happening behind the scenes here is, although the first invocation takes quite a long time, it's building up the information that's required, and that's cached locally on the system. So any subsequent interactions with the remote system are very much quicker. So we can see some more detail there in the capture, but we're not too interested in that now. Let's start up the Impact Explorer, and what we should see in there is we should have 2 new events. So just have to wait a moment or two while that starts up. Let's get rid of some of these other windows. Okay, just logging in. Okay, and let's have a look for those events. Okay, so let's check all the events by status, and we can see we've got 2 new events created now. Our first was the test from the testing console, and our second was the execution as the service itself. Okay, there we go. Then let's have a quick recap of what we did. So first of all, we installed the web service, we confirmed it was listening, and we double checked the ports that it was listening on. We used Internet Explorer to retrieve the web service definition. We double checked our firewall. We made sure that the ports were open, and we recalled that a local test bypassed that firewall. We then moved on to using SOAP UI to send some requests to the web service, and we used the network sniffer to monitor those requests were completed successfully. After we'd done all that, we had a completed working system with integration between BMC Enterprise Manager and System Center Orchestrator. Thanks for watching, folks.